You know the face. It's printed on t-shirts, painted on murals, and plastered on posters all over the world. But welcome to today's Explainer, where we are going to impartially unpack the actual, dense history of an intensely polarizing figure, Ernesto Che Guevara. Whether you view him as a selfless, heroic martyr or a ruthless authoritarian, the man is universally recognized. So today, we're cutting through the iconic imagery and the pop culture myth to examine the historical reality of who he really was, using data and primary accounts to guide us.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll be moving through 5 chapters: Becoming Che, the Cuban Revolution, Building the New Man, Exporting the Revolution, and finally, a polarizing legacy. We're going to trace his whole chronological evolution, starting as a traveling medical student, all the way to his death and his transformation into a global symbol. Let's dive right in.
Section 1. Becoming Che, from medical student to Marxist. We have to start with Ernesto Guevara de la Serna, an upper-class Argentine medical student. And it's interesting, because despite suffering from this acute asthma that would literally plague him his entire life, he was a determined athlete. He had a voracious appetite for literature, reading everything from poetry to dense philosophy. But ultimately, it was his hunger to see the outside world that completely altered his trajectory.
In his early 20s, he went on these massive continental journeys, the trips famously documented in his motorcycle diaries. Out there, he witnessed extreme, systemic poverty firsthand, destitute copper miners, isolated leper colonies. It had a profound impact on him. But the real turning point? That was 1954 in Guatemala. He actually witnessed the CIA-backed overthrow of the democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, who had just tried to implement agrarian land reform against the interests of the United Fruit Company. Seeing that happen forged his ironclad belief that the U.S. was an imperialist power and that only armed Marxist struggle could end the exploitation of Latin America. Just a year later, in Mexico, he met Fidel Castro, and, well, he found his war.
Section 2. The Cuban Revolution, the Guerrilla Commander. Driven by this deep ideological conviction, he officially joined Castro's 26th of July movement. In 1956, he and 81 other rebels arrived in Cuba on a leaky, completely overcrowded cabin cruiser named the Granma. Their goal was almost unfathomable at the time: overthrowing the US-backed Batista dictatorship.
Once they set up deep in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, a really fascinating duality emerged in his leadership. Earning the rank of comandante, he was on one hand a totally dedicated teacher. He built grenade factories, health clinics, and organized schools to teach illiterate peasants how to read. But he was also a ruthless disciplinarian with a chilling detachment to violence. He personally executed men who were accused of being informers or deserters. He was feared, for sure, but also deeply respected by his troops.
And to really understand his tactical brilliance, you have to look at the decisive 1958 Battle of Santa Clara. This was during a grueling month-long march to physically cut the island in half. His forces were completely surrounded and massively outgunned. Yet they pulled off a victory despite being outnumbered 10-1. It was a masterclass in modern hit-and-run guerrilla warfare that completely broke the back of the government forces. Dictator Fulgencio Batista was forced to flee Cuba on New Year's Day 1959.
Section 3. Building the New Man, the Cuban Statesman. The revolution was victorious. The dust settled, and suddenly, Guevara transitioned from a rugged rebel out in the mountains to a powerful, suit-wearing administrator in Havana. But as he quickly found out, actually ruling is vastly more complicated than rebelling.
In the new government, he ended up holding vast, often very contradictory power. Looking neutrally at the historical record, as commander of the La Cabaña fortress, he oversaw revolutionary tribunals. He ordered anywhere between 55 and 105 executions of Batista officials by firing squad, largely without respect for due process. Economically, he became a virtual czar, leading agrarian reform and pushing rapid industrialization plans that ultimately failed and caused productivity to plummet. And maybe most bizarrely, as president of the National Bank, he literally signed the nation's currency with his nickname, Che. It was a deliberate, mocking signal of his profound ideological distaste for money itself.
What he really desperately wanted was to eliminate capitalism entirely and replace it with this concept, el hombre nuevo, or the new man. Guevara firmly believed that structural economic changes meant absolutely nothing if there wasn't a fundamental psychological transformation to go with it. He wanted a society driven by moral incentives, where people worked for solidarity and the collective good, not just for a paycheck.
And to lead by example, he routinely worked punishing 36-hour shifts and even spent his days off doing voluntary manual labor, like cutting sugarcane.
Now, while his grand economic policies were floundering and the sugar harvests were dropping severely, his push for education was undeniably effective. In 1961, he spearheaded the Year of Education. The government mobilized 100,000 volunteers into literacy brigades, sending them deep into rural areas. This massive, coordinated effort successfully boosted the national literacy rate from around 68% to an absolutely astonishing 96%.
As the 1960s rolled on, Guevara became an international diplomat for Cuba. But his rhetoric was growing more and more radical. He became highly critical of both the United States' capitalist exploitation and the Soviet Union's bureaucratic compromises. He was delivering these fiery, unapologetic speeches at the United Nations, aggressively denouncing imperialism and segregation. And then in 1965, right at the absolute height of his global fame, he mysteriously dropped out of Cuban public life altogether.
Section 4. Exporting the Revolution, the International Failures. What happened was, he wrote a secret farewell letter to Fidel Castro, formally renouncing his Cuban citizenship, his military rank, and all his government positions. His new goal? To secretly foment anti-imperialist revolutions abroad.
His first attempt was in the Congo in 1965, and frankly, it was a complete disaster. He showed up with 100 Afro-Cuban fighters, aiming to teach Marxist guerrilla tactics to local rebels. But he was quickly thwarted by CIA-backed mercenaries who were actively monitoring his communications, and there was a profound lack of discipline and will to fight among the local forces. Sick with dysentery and struggling with acute asthma, he was forced to flee across Lake Tanganyika after just 7 months. He explicitly admitted in his own diary that the mission was a total failure, writing that you simply cannot liberate a country that doesn't want to fight.
But that massive failure didn't deter him. He arrived in Bolivia in disguise in late 1966, hoping to ignite a continent-wide revolution. Instead, pretty much everything went wrong. His shortwave radios failed, cutting him off completely from Cuba. He couldn't get any support from the local peasants or the Bolivian Communist Party. And eventually, his sick, starving column was encircled by U.S.-trained Bolivian Rangers. On October 8, 1967, he was wounded and captured. The very next day, the Bolivian president ordered his immediate execution. His reported defiant last words were aimed at Mario Terán, the half-drunk Bolivian sergeant who was tasked with killing him in a dilapidated rural schoolhouse. Terán opened fire, shooting him 9 times. Ernesto Che Guevara was dead at the age of 39.
Section 5. A polarizing legacy. The enduring symbol. The man was dead, yes, but the symbol, that was just being born. Following his execution, the Bolivian military displayed his body to the press, and those post-mortem photographs, showing his eyes open with this almost tranquil expression, drew immediate, startling comparisons to classical paintings of Christ. It instantly elevated him to the status of a global martyr.
Decades later, when we look at his legacy objectively, we see that it remains fiercely divided. On one end of the spectrum, he is intensely revered as a selfless, egalitarian hero, someone who willingly gave up immense power to fight and ultimately die for the poor and oppressed. On the exact opposite end, he is reviled as a violent extremist, a ruthless executioner who helped install an authoritarian regime, ruined an economy, and aggressively suppressed political dissent. Again, our goal in this explainer isn't to tell you which view is right, but to unpack exactly why both of these very strong views exist.
And honestly, here lies perhaps the greatest irony of this entire story. This fierce Marxist, a man who harbored a profound, fundamental hatred for money and capitalism, has been completely and utterly absorbed by the free market. That single photograph has been transformed into one of the most heavily commercialized logos and fashion statements in modern human history.
We've traced the life of an asthmatic doctor who became a ruthless guerrilla, a failed economist, and a doomed revolutionary. It is a wildly complex story. So I want to leave you with this final thought. When history smooths over all those jagged, contradictory edges to mass produce a symbol of rebellion, what vital truths get left behind?